There's a strange kind of ignorance that comes from knowing too much. You can study love without loving, study fear without facing it, read about presence without ever being present, and you can spend your entire life learning how to understand the world while never actually experiencing it. This is the story of a man who knew almost everything about life, except what it felt like to live. Julian's left index finger was stained yellow from highlighting an old copy of Wittgenstein. He had been sitting at the same desk for almost an hour, comparing one footnote with a passage from the Upanishads. His dinner was still sitting beside him, a sleeve of saltine crackers, cold coffee, a dictionary lying open beneath his elbow. His phone vibrated. A message from the department chair. The video of his latest debate had crossed 50,000 views. Julian looked at the notification, then he turned the phone face down and went back to the book. He was 35 years old. He had spent most of his life becoming very good at understanding things. Philosophy, religion, psychology, history. He could explain where an idea came from, who had criticized it, which translation was considered unreliable, and what its original author probably meant. Put him in front of an audience, and he was almost impossible to challenge. He remembered obscure references, he noticed contradictions. He could take an argument apart without raising his voice. People admired him for it. Julian had built a career out of knowing. There was only one problem. He was becoming increasingly unsure whether he actually knew how to live. He could explain what honey meant in dozens of languages. He knew its chemistry, its history, its importance in ancient poetry. He knew how different cultures had used it as a symbol for sweetness, desire, medicine, and devotion. But he rarely ate honey, not because he disliked it. He simply never thought about it. That was Julian's problem. He was always standing one step away from his own life, observing it. When he felt anxious, he studied anxiety. When he felt lonely, he read about loneliness. When something frightened him, he tried to understand why fear existed. The moment an experience became uncomfortable, he turned it into an object of study. Psychologists have a name for this pattern: intellectualization. It happens when someone uses thinking to distance themselves from feelings they don't want to experience directly. Grief becomes a subject, love becomes a theory, fear becomes a biological response. A sunset becomes an explanation of light. The explanation may be completely correct, but something is missing: the experience itself. Julian didn't see this as a problem. In fact, he thought the opposite. He believed understanding protected him. If he could understand something completely, he wouldn't have to be vulnerable to it. That belief followed him everywhere. Until one night, he met Thomas. Thomas worked on the university grounds. He was 62. He had spent most of his adult life repairing walls, clearing paths, and fixing things that broke. Julian knew almost nothing about him. They passed each other most evenings. That night, Thomas was sitting beside the maintenance shed on an overturned bucket. He was eating a cold fried egg sandwich wrapped in foil. "Evening, Professor." Julian stopped. "Evening." Thomas looked at him. "I saw your talk tonight." Julian smiled politely. "Did you?" "I did." Thomas took another bite. "You had a lot to say about the light." Julian knew exactly what he meant. The lecturer was making several historical errors. Thomas nodded. "I suppose he was." Julian waited. Usually this was where the conversation became interesting. Someone would challenge him. He would explain. They would disagree. He would correct them. Instead, Thomas looked toward the chapel. The building was barely visible in the darkness. "4 in the morning is my favorite time here," Thomas said. Julian looked at him. "Why?" Thomas shrugged. "Sometimes the fog comes in from the river." He paused. "Hits the warm brick on the chapel wall." Another pause. "And you can hear the whole building settling." Julian almost smiled. There was already an explanation forming in his head. Temperature changes, expansion, contraction, acoustics, environmental conditions. He knew exactly how he could explain what Thomas was hearing. But Thomas continued. Sometimes it feels like I'm not standing on the ground. He looked down at his sandwich. Feels like the ground is holding me up. Julian said nothing. For perhaps the first time in his life, he didn't immediately know what to say. Because Thomas wasn't making an argument. He wasn't presenting a theory. He wasn't claiming that the earth literally had intentions. He was describing what it felt like to stand there at 4 in the morning. Julian had spent years studying experiences like this. He had read thousands of pages about wonder, presence, consciousness, awe, and transcendence. He had written papers about them. He had debated them. He had criticized other people's interpretations of them. But he suddenly realized something uncomfortable. He had spent years studying the menu. He had never tasted the food. Julian looked toward the chapel. He knew almost everything there was to know about it. He knew its architectural style. He knew where the limestone had come from. He knew when the building had been constructed. He knew how the vaulted ceiling distributed its weight. But he couldn't remember the last time he had simply stood beneath it, without measuring it, without explaining it, without asking what it meant. He had mistaken knowledge about life for contact with life, and perhaps that was the trap, because knowledge can give you distance. Distance can make you feel safe. You can analyze a storm from inside a building. You can understand rain without getting wet. You can read about loneliness without ever admitting that you are lonely. You can study love for 20 years and still be terrified when someone actually loves you. And our world makes this easier than ever. We measure our sleep instead of asking whether we feel rested. We read books about being present while checking our phones between chapters. We analyze our relationships, track our habits, count our steps, record our moods, measure our productivity. We turn our lives into information and then wonder why they sometimes feel strangely empty. Julian stood beside Thomas for another few minutes. Neither of them spoke. The university was quiet. The windows of the chapel were dark. Somewhere beyond the buildings, a car passed on the road. Julian looked up at the spire. For once, he didn't think about its architecture. He didn't remember the date it was built. He didn't think about the physics holding it together. He simply looked at it. Then he asked Thomas, "How long have you noticed things like that?" Thomas folded the foil around the remains of his sandwich. "Hard to say." He thought for a moment. "Probably since I stopped trying to explain everything." Julian smiled, a small, almost embarrassed smile. Then Thomas added, "Sometimes you miss what's happening because you're too busy deciding what it means." Julian looked back at the chapel. For the first time that night, there was nothing to solve, no argument to win, no theory to test, no footnote to check. Just cold air, damp gravel, a dark building, and the strange feeling of standing somewhere, without needing to understand it. Julian stayed there a little longer. He had spent 35 years collecting maps. That night, for the first time, he put one down, because eventually, you have to leave the library. You have to step outside and find out what the world actually feels like beneath your feet.